You tap a piece of glass on your phone, and a hot meal just appears at your door.
Right.
You swipe a piece of plastic, and suddenly this massive algorithm calculates a flight path to fly you across an entire ocean.
It feels like magic.
It really does. I mean, for the better part of the last 30 years,
Right.
we've been fundamentally conditioned to believe that the global economy is just software.
Just entirely frictionless.
Exactly. Frictionless, invisible, like it's just this digital machine that exists purely up in the cloud. But that is a profound illusion.
A massive illusion.
Yeah, because the economy isn't made of code. It's made of steel and diesel and copper and, sweat. And we only actually realize this when the physical world suddenly and violently asserts itself.
Right, like when a shipping lane gets tricked off.
Or weather pattern shifts. And in an instant, that frictionless digital magic just completely shatters.
And then you find yourself staring directly at the grinding, rusty gears of physical supply chains.
Yeah. And welcome to the deep dive, by the way. If you're listening right now, you know exactly what we're talking about.
The realization always comes as a shock to the system, doesn't it?
Oh, totally.
I mean, we built this entire civilization based on the assumption of, seamless delivery. The consumer is intentionally shielded from the actual mechanics, the extraction, the refinement, the logistics.
Out of sight, out of mind.
Exactly. So when the physical world breaks, the immediate reaction in the digital financial world is pure panic, followed by this desperate scramble to just pretend everything is fine.
Which is exactly what we're looking at today. We are looking at the fallout from that exact collision. Because if you open your inbox or, you scroll through your news feed right now, you are just being bombarded by this fractured puzzle.
It's overwhelming.
It is. We've got this massive stack of sources from April 2026. We're talking complex economic reports, high-stakes political filings, tech sector updates, market analyses.
So hitting at once.
Right. You see headlines screaming about a war in the Middle East, and then right next to it, a new subscription tier for an AI coding tool. Or investigations into the NFL, and somehow an impending crisis over the price of a postage stamp.
Which just looks like absolute chaos to the average person.
It looks insane.
But the human brain struggles to process these events simultaneously because, the media silos them.
Yeah, like geopolitics goes in one bucket.
Right. Tech goes in another bucket, and then personal finance goes in a third. But those silos are totally artificial.
They don't exist.
No. The reality is that there is a singular, massive tectonic shift driving every single one of these stories. The friction of the physical world is fundamentally rewriting the rules of the digital economy.
Okay, let's unpack this, because if you are an investor watching your portfolio swing wildly, or, a software developer eyeing the whole AI gold rush.
Or just someone buying groceries.
Exactly. Or just someone trying to figure out why checking a bag on an airplane feels like highway robbery lately, this deep dive is engineered for you.
We really want to connect the dots here.
Yeah, our mission today is to connect the mechanics behind these headlines. And to do that, we have to start at the physical epicenter of the current crisis, like the ultimate choke point.
The Strait of Hormuz.
Right. So we've had this 6-week war between the United States and Iran, and it has just been paused by this very fragile 2-week ceasefire.
Brokered heavily by Pakistan, which is a key detail.
Yes, heavily brokered by Pakistan. And if you look purely at the financial markets, the reaction was just euphoric.
Oh, the markets loved it.
The second that news hit the wire, the Dow turned positive for the year. The S&P 500 rallied up to 6,824.
Which is a massive jump.
A huge jump. And European travel stocks, companies like EasyJet and Lufthansa, they literally skyrocketed up to 10% in a single trading session. Plus gold standing around, $4,648 an ounce.
And that market reaction is the absolute perfect illustration of algorithmic trading divorcing itself from physical reality. Well, the financial markets trade what we call paper barrels of oil, futures contracts that just move the speed of light across fiber optic cables.
Okay.
They essentially priced in the political intention of peace. But the physical market, that relies on wet barrels.
Wet barrels, like actual oil.
Actual viscous hydrocarbons sitting in these massive steel holes that have to physically navigate a very narrow, highly militarized waterway.
Right. And the people dealing in those wet barrels are issuing some pretty severe warnings right now.
They're terrified.
Yeah, Sultan Ahmed Al Jaber, the CEO of the UAE's AENOC, he cut right through all that market euphoria. His statement was incredibly stark. He basically said the Strait of Hormuz is not open.
No, not at all.
Iran is actively controlling access. They are dictating who passes, when they pass, and under what conditions. And Al-Jaber specifically called this coercion.
Right, not freedom of navigation. Coercion.
Exactly.
And the geographic reality of the Strait of Hormuz makes that coercion highly effective. I mean, at its narrowest point, the strait is only 21 miles wide.
Wow. Only 21 miles.
21 miles. And the shipping lanes have to accommodate these massive, very large crude carriers, or VLCCs.
Right.
These ships cannot just simply turn around or reroute easily. And before this conflict, roughly 20% of the entire global oil supply squeezed through that one specific artery.
20%.
Yeah. So by forcing ships to obtain explicit permission, Iran has effectively created a militarized toll booth.
And the downstream effect of that toll booth is this staggering maritime traffic jam. I mean, right now, there are currently 230 tankers loaded with oil just sitting idle.
Just waiting?
Just waiting. Think of the Strait of Hormuz like a kink in a garden hose, right?
Yeah.
The stock market is popping champagne because someone walked over and put their hand on the faucet,
Yeah.
signaling they might turn it on.
Right, the intention's there.
But the kink is still there. The water still isn't flowing. The pressure's just compounding behind the blockage.
And a traffic jam of 230 supertankers presents a logistical nightmare that you simply cannot solve with a diplomatic signature.
You can't just wave a pen.
No. You require specialized maritime pilots to navigate these vessels through the strait. The insurance premiums for moving these ships through a contested zone are just astronomical right now.
Oh, I bet.
Even if a permanent treaty were signed today, untangling that backlog and getting the global supply chain back to normal flow rates, that would take months.
Months. And a permanent treaty seems incredibly distant when you look at the political posture anyway. And, we have to report the political facts impartially here. We're just looking at the statements.
Absolutely. Just the facts.
Right. So former President Trump stated that U.S. forces will remain deployed in the region until a, quote, real agreement is reached and fully complied with.
Right.
And he warned of a massive, unprecedented military response if the ceasefire is breached. Plus, he dismissed a reported 10-point Iranian peace plan, which purportedly demanded an end to Israeli strikes on Lebanon and lifting all sanctions. He called that, quote, totally fake.
And then, on the other side of the Atlantic, we also see this severe strain this puts on allied nations.
Yeah, the U.K.
Right. UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer expressed intense frustration. He stated he is fed up with domestic UK energy bills being held hostage by the actions of Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin.
Right, just reporting his exact phrasing there.
Exactly. Starmer also openly criticized Israel's ongoing strikes on Lebanon during this fragile window. The geopolitical gridlock is just absolute.
But I have to challenge the market logic here, though. I mean, the algorithms drove airlines and travel stocks up 10% on this news.
Which is wild.
Right, because airlines are acutely sensitive to the price of jet fuel. If those 230 tankers aren't moving and the jet fuel isn't actually reaching the refineries, the investors buying airline stock must know they're buying a pure fiction, right? Like, are they just betting on a headline and ignoring the physical shortage?
Well, the bet is based on a fundamental miscalculation of macroeconomic health.
What do you mean?
Investors assume that if the war ends and the oil flows again, the economy just simply snaps back to its pre-war baseline.
Like a rubber band.
Right. But the fatal flaw in that logic is that the pre-war baseline was already catastrophic.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. The war just accelerated a crisis that was fully baked into the system before a single shot was fired.
Okay, that leads directly into the macro squeeze, because the highest levels of the global financial apparatus are sounding the alarm right now. Kristalina Georgieva, the managing director of the IMF, she delivered a really blunt assessment. She stated that all roads point into higher inflation and slower growth.
And that combination is the absolute worst-case scenario for central bankers.
Stagflation.
Exactly. Stagflation, a stagnant economy coupled with soaring prices.
And the data from February 2026, which crucially was before the Middle East conflict caused this big energy spike, that data completely proves her point. Core PCE, which is the Federal Reserve's preferred gauge for inflation, was stubbornly stuck at 3%.
Which is too high.
Way too high. And simultaneously, the GDP growth rate for the fourth quarter of 2025 was revised down to this anemic 0.5%.
So the central bank policy trap is fully engaged.
Right. They're stuck.
They're completely trapped. I mean, if the Fed cuts interest rates to try and stimulate that 0.5% growth, they just pour gasoline on the 3% inflation.
Right.
But if they hike rates to kill the inflation, they push the economy into a deep, deep recession.
And economists in our sources are looking at this trap and drawing these immediate comparisons to the 1997 Asian financial crisis. But the underlying mechanics of 1997 versus 2026 are entirely different, right? And understanding that difference is vital.
What's fascinating here is that the 1997 crisis was a paper crisis. It was driven by structural flaws in balance sheets.
Right. Developing economies in Asia had pegged their local currencies to the US dollar while simultaneously taking on massive amounts of short-term debt denominated in those dollars.
Which is incredibly risky.
Extremely. So when foreign investors panicked and pulled their capital, those central banks just didn't have enough US dollars in reserve to defend the peg.
The currencies collapsed.
Exactly. And paying back dollar-denominated debt with worthless local currency just triggered mass defaults.
But today, the financial architecture is much more robust. As David Lubin from Chatham House notes in our sources, most of these economies now operate with floating exchange rates.
Okay, so they absorb shocks rather than snapping under pressure.
Right. And more importantly, they have stockpiled massive foreign exchange reserves. I mean, South Korea is sitting on over $400 billion. India holds roughly $688 billion.
Wow. But see, a financial buffer only solves the financial problem.
Exactly.
Brad Setzer from the Council on Foreign Relations highlights the true terror of the 2026 crisis. He says this is a shock to the physical current account. Having $688 billion in the bank doesn't matter if there is no physical fuel to buy.
Right.
You cannot burn stacks of currency in a diesel engine to keep a freight truck moving.
No, you definitely cannot. Now, the central banks can use those reserves to temporarily subsidize the cost of energy for their citizens, shielding them from the sticker shock for a few months.
Like, right, a temporary Band-Aid.
But eventually the money burns up, and the physical shortage is still there. And corporations operating in this environment of low growth and high input costs, they have zero margin for error.
None.
Their only survival mechanism is to pass the friction directly down the chain.
And the end of that chain is always you, the consumer.
Always.
Let's look at how this geopolitical gridlock translates into your daily financial punishment. American Airlines just announced a severe hike in baggage fees. If you purchase a basic economy ticket, checking a single suitcase will now cost you $55.
$55 for one bag.
One bag. And they are not hiding the reason. The airlines are pointing directly at the Middle East conflict and the resulting spike in jet fuel costs.
Well, jet fuel is an airline's second largest operational expense, right after labor.
Right.
When the Strait of Hormuz chokes off the global supply of crude, refineries simply cannot produce aviation fuel at scale. So the cost per gallon spikes. American Airlines cannot absorb that margin compression, so they extract a geopolitical tax directly from the passenger.
It's crazy. You are literally paying a premium on your vacation luggage to offset a maritime blockade halfway around the world.
Yeah.
And it extends far beyond corporate America, too. It's hitting foundational public services. The United States Postal Service is signaling a catastrophic financial crisis right now. Mail volume has plummeted by 104 billion pieces since 2006.
Which is a huge structural problem because the USPS mandate requires them to be self-funding.
Right. They do not operate on taxpayer dollar.
Exactly. They rely entirely on the sale of postage and services.
Yeah.
So a drop of 104 billion pieces represents an $81 billion evaporation of revenue based on their current pricing models.
So to compensate, the USPS is proposing a hike on first-class stamps to 82 cents by July.
Wow.
But the more alarming detail is the proposal of an 8% fuel surcharge on package and express deliveries. Just like the airlines, the USPS is citing the Iran war and fuel volatility. The financial strain is so acute that they are even discussing suspending employer contributions to their employees' retirement funds just to make payroll.
That's dire. Every physical movement of goods now carries a penalty.
Yeah.
But what's really interesting is that while the cost of mobility, traveling, shipping, while that skyrockets, the American consumer is paradoxically trapped in place by the macro economy. The housing market perfectly illustrates this paralysis.
Oh, the lock-in effect.
Mortgage rates have ticked back up to 6.37%. Consequently, mortgage refinance activity has plummeted by 11.4%.
Right.
But this dynamic creates this incredible structural anomaly. because the NAHB Westlake Royal Remodeling Market Index is holding remarkably strong at a reading of 62.
And just for context, anything above 50 on that index indicates positive sentiment and growth.
Exactly, so it's booming.
And that remodeling boom is completely driven by the lock-in effect. Millions of homeowners secured 30-year fixed mortgages at roughly 3% during the pandemic era.
Right, the golden handcuff.
Exactly. Moving to a new house today means surrendering that 3% rate and taking on a 6.37% rate. The mathematics are just punishing. They're financially imprisoned in their current homes. So if your family is growing or, your remote work situation changes, you can't afford to move. So you remodel the house you were trapped in. Our sources show that only 4% of remodeling projects right now are to prepare a home for sale. The vast majority are nesting adaptations.
But here's the friction. Funding a massive kitchen remodel while simultaneously paying 8% fuel surcharges and $55 bag fees. That requires capital.
Capital that people don't have.
Right. With wages stagnant due to that 0.5% GDP growth we talked about, consumers are increasingly bridging the gap with debt. The pressure in the consumer credit system is reaching a critical threshold.
Yeah, the debt relief landscape outlined in our sources reveals the desperate mechanics middle-class families are deploying right now. Like, the first defense is debt consolidation.
Right.
Companies like Happy Money are offering loans up to $40,000 to bundle high-interest credit card debt into a single lower-rate payment.
But consolidation assumes the consumer still has a viable credit score. It's a restructuring maneuver, really. But when the consumer crosses the line into actual insolvency, they turn to debt settlement. Agencies like Freedom Debt Relief advise clients to intentionally stop paying their creditors.
Which tanks your credit score.
It destroys it. The money instead goes into an escrow account. The agency then uses the leverage of that ruined credit score to negotiate a lump sum payoff with the creditor, often aiming to reduce the principal by maybe 20 to 25% after fees.
But the hidden trap there is the tax liability.
Yes.
The tax bomb.
Because forgiven debt can be treated as taxable income by the IRS. You settle a $20,000 credit card bill for $10,000, and suddenly you owe taxes on the $10,000 difference as if you earned it on your paycheck.
It catches so many people off guard.
And when settlement fails, the absolute final backstop is bankruptcy.
And the structural difference between bankruptcy options dictates the next decade of the consumer's life.
Right. Chapter 7 versus Chapter 13. Exactly. Chapter 7 is a pure liquidation. A court-appointed trustee seizes and sells non-exempt assets to satisfy creditors. It wipes the slate relatively clean, but it completely destroys your credit for a decade.
And Chapter 13.
Chapter 13 is a reorganization. The debtor gets to keep their assets, but they submit to a brutal court-mandated repayment plan lasting 3 to 5 years. You are effectively handing control of your income to a judge.
Okay, I'm looking at the sequence of events, and the mechanics just don't add up on the labor side.
What do you mean?
Well, we've established that the lock-in effect is driving a nationwide remodeling boom.
Right.
But if you have tried to hire a contractor recently, you know the wait lists are months long. How is a remodeling boom physically sustaining itself in such a tight labor market? Are there even enough construction workers?
The short answer is no. The domestic workforce cannot sustain it.
Wow.
The physical execution of the remodeling boom relies entirely on a massive demographic shift within the construction sector. The industry has become structurally dependent on immigrant labor to function.
Yeah, the Ion Housing Report details this reliance with incredible granularity. Immigrants now constitute a record 26.3% of the entire U.S. construction workforce.
More than 1 in 4 workers.
Yeah. And when you look at specific geographies, the numbers jump drastically. In California, immigrants make up 42% of the construction labor force. Florida is at 41%.
Wow.
Texas is at 39%.
And historically, that concentration was localized to border states. But the critical shift is that this demographic reliance is now a nationwide phenomenon.
Right.
Nevada's construction workforce is 38% immigrant. Maryland and New Jersey are at 37%. The labor shortage has forced this geographic dispersion.
And the data gets even more specific when you look at the trades required for remodeling. The highest concentration of foreign-born workers is in the physically punishing, labor-intensive finishing trades. Drywall and ceiling tile installers are 57% immigrants.
Over half.
Yeah. Plasterers and stucco masons are at 56%. Roofers and painters are at 53%. Carpet and floor installers at 51%.
Without that specific demographic pillar, the housing market's adaptation to the lock-in effect would just collapse. The physical labor to actually install the drywall simply would not exist.
Right.
Yet even with this massive influx, the National Association of Home Builders reports severe ongoing shortages. Over 50% of builders report a deficit in finished carpentry alone.
Oh, wow.
And the shortages are also acute in technical trades, electricians, plumbers, HVAC technicians, which require extensive domestic licensing and apprenticeships, creating this artificial bottleneck.
So we have an economic model reliant on remodeling, which is bottlenecked by labor. But the materials you are putting inside those newly remodeled kitchens face a far more existential threat.
Oh, absolutely.
Because the physical world is breaking down on a second front, entirely separate from the Strait of Hormuz.
Right. The intersection of global climatology and the geopolitical blockade is setting the stage for a catastrophic shock to the global food supply.
Yeah, meteorologists and climate scientists are tracking the formation of a super El Niño weather event projected to hit in late 2026.
And the physical mechanics of an El Niño are driven by sea surface temperatures in the tropical eastern Pacific rising above the long-term average.
Right.
A super El Niño means those temperatures surge at least 2 degrees Celsius above normal, completely disrupting the Walker circulation, which is the atmospheric airflow over the tropical Pacific Ocean.
And that disruption totally alters global precipitation patterns. Regions that rely on heavy rainfall face severe drought, while arid regions face flooding. For global agriculture, a super El Niño applies massive environmental stress to crop yields.
And historically, modern agriculture compensates for weather stress through chemistry.
Right. You inject nitrogen fertilizers into the soil to force the yield, essentially masking the environmental deficit. The Haber-Bosch process, which synthesizes ammonia for fertilizer, is arguably the only reason the Earth can sustain 8 billion people.
It's miraculous, really.
It is. But creating that nitrogen fertilizer requires massive amounts of natural gas.
Which brings us directly back to the Middle East.
Yep.
The region is not just a source of crude oil. It is a primary hub for global fertilizer production. The military blockade in the Strait of Hormuz is currently choking off roughly 1/3 of the entire world's seaborne fertilizer trade.
It's terrifying, the synergy of these two disasters. You have a super El Niño stressing the crops in places like India, Australia, Brazil, and Argentina, which puts immense upward pressure on commodities like cocoa, rice, and sugar.
Right.
And simultaneously, the exact chemical compound needed to save those crops is trapped behind a wall of supertankers in a war zone.
Paul Donovan, the chief economist at UBS, outlined the severity of this exact scenario. While the financial media just obsessively tracks the price of oil, Donovan warned that drought and limited water supply combined with a shortage of nitrogen present a far more destabilizing threat.
It's the food, not the oil.
Exactly. Dawit Hale from 91 was equally blunt in our sources, stating that if these two negative factors combine, it will be incredibly tough going. He emphasized that the fertilizer shortage stemming from the Iran conflict is far more severe than the initial shocks experienced during the Russia-Ukraine war.
And the human cost is quantified by the UN World Food Program. Their models project that if the conflict persists and energy constraints remain tight, the number of people facing acute hunger could surge by an additional 45 million globally.
45 million more people.
Yeah. This compounds the crisis for the 318 million people already experiencing severe food insecurity.
The mechanical link here is undeniable. The global economy is a physical system. The labor swinging the hammer in your kitchen is constrained by domestic demographics. The food in your pantry is constrained by ocean temperatures in the Pacific and artillery fire in the Persian Gulf.
Okay, I have to pause the analysis here because there is a glaring contradiction in the broader narrative.
What's that?
We just outlined a world where physical constraints are choking the life out of supply chains, right? Yet, the dominant cultural and financial narrative right now revolves entirely around the tech sector.
Oh, the AI boom.
The AI boom. It's generating massive valuations. Everyone is talking about software eating the world. How does the digital sector maintain this illusion of infinite scale while the physical world literally burns? Why does the tech industry seem totally immune?
Well, it's because the tech industry relies heavily on the abstraction of the cloud to convince investors that they are immune to physical limits.
Right, the cloud.
But the cloud is just a marketing term for millions of hyper-dense, incredibly power-hungry computers sitting in massive concrete warehouses. The virtual world is actually on a direct collision course with physical reality.
Let's look at the financial mechanics of that AI gold rush then. OpenAI just rolled out a new subscription tier for heavy users of its Codex tool, which is an AI-powered coding assistant. It costs $100 a month.
$100 a month.
And they are locked in this massive pricing war with Anthropic, whose Claude Code tool features subscription tiers at $100 and $200 a month.
And the value proposition of these tools is basically software billing software. Developers eagerly pay $200 a month because the AI dramatically accelerates their output.
It pays for itself.
Right. And the revenue generation is staggering. Anthropic's tool alone hit a run rate revenue of over $2.5 billion by February. OpenAI's Codex boasts 3 million weekly active users. The cash flow is massive.
But to process the computing demands of millions of developers writing code via AI, these companies require unprecedented infrastructure. Mark Zuckerberg's Meta just executed a $21 billion cloud infrastructure deal with a specialized provider called CoreWeave.
$21 billion.
$21 billion to secure dedicated computing capacity utilizing the absolute latest NVIDIA GPU platforms.
The scale of that capital expenditure is almost difficult to comprehend.
Yeah.
The market was so thoroughly shocked by Meta's aggressiveness that it triggered a massive short squeeze.
Oh, I saw that.
Yeah, investors who had bet against CoreWeave short sellers, assuming the AI infrastructure play was overvalued, they were violently forced to cover their positions as the stock surged. It resulted in roughly $955 million in mark-to-market losses for the shorts.
Wall Street is just pouring billions into the cloud. But here is the friction.
Man.
You cannot run a $21 billion NVIDIA GPU cluster on venture capital.
No, you cannot.
An AI server rack is exponentially more power dense than a traditional web server. It generates massive amounts of heat. It requires an ocean of electricity to compute and literally millions of gallons of water just to cool the facilities.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the friction occurs when this insatiable digital demand for power collides with local physical power grids that are already strained by the stagflationary environment we discussed earlier.
Yes. And this clash is playing out right now in Maine. The state legislature is poised to pass an unprecedented measure, a complete temporary ban on data center construction until November 2027.
Maine is literally putting up a physical wall against the digital cloud.
Because they have to. The legislators are acting out of self-preservation. They recognize that dropping a hyperscale data center onto their local electrical grid will just exhaust capacity.
Right.
Utility companies would have to build new power plants and transmission lines to handle the load, and those infrastructure costs get passed directly to local residents through higher utility rates.
And Maine already suffers from some of the highest electricity rates in the country. Seth Berry, from a nonprofit called Our Power, summarized the stakes perfectly in our sources. He argued that allowing data centers to artificially inflate power costs would be devastating for the lower and working class populations.
It's like building a fleet of million-dollar Ferraris, but suddenly realizing the state just banned the construction of gas stations.
Exactly. You essentially have global AI companies trying to siphon off the cheap electricity required by local citizens to just heat their homes. It is the ultimate mechanical failure of the AI thesis. You can write the most brilliant algorithmic code in history, but if a local municipality refuses to grant you a zoning permit for the power substation required to turn the servers on, the code is worthless.
The digital economy is fundamentally subordinate to the physical economy.
100%.
And the friction isn't just electrical, it's regulatory too. In Florida, Attorney General James Uthmeier is launching a sweeping investigation into OpenAI right as the company is gearing up for an IPO that analysts project could value it at $1 trillion.
And the Florida Attorney General's probe relies on a mixture of national security and consumer protection claims.
Right. And again, we are maintaining strict neutrality on these allegations, just reporting the facts of the probe.
Of course, the subpoena cites concerns regarding the technology potentially being accessed by foreign adversaries, specifically China. It also outlines severe allegations tying the chatbot's output to criminal behavior, child safety compromises, and a recent mass shooting at Florida State University.
Regardless of the ultimate legal validity of those specific claims, the mechanism of the probe is what matters to the market. State-level regulatory action acts as physical gravity on a digital company's valuation. Navigating subpoenas from 50 different states introduces massive friction into the timeline of a $1 trillion IPO.
Right, but the complexity of these issues, the collision of AI data centers with local power grids, the geopolitical implications of tech, requires immense focus to solve. Yet the political apparatus often defaults to theater. Look at the context surrounding the Maine data center ban.
Yeah, the sources indicate that Maine's Governor Janet Mills might actually veto this groundbreaking legislation.
Why?
Well, the underlying motivation seems to be raw electoral politics. Governor Mills is currently running for the U.S. Senate in a highly competitive Democratic primary against an oyster farmer named Graham Plattner, who is actually currently leading in the polls. So she's playing politics. It seems like policy and politics are just distracting us from the actual systemic issues.
Oh, exactly. A veto driven by a primary challenge perfectly illustrates the disconnect. Critical infrastructure decisions that will dictate the state's energy future for a decade are being manipulated for short-term political survival.
And the political theater acts as an intentional distraction. It provides the public with a digestible narrative, a horse race between a governor and an oyster farmer, while masking the far more complex systemic reality that the grid simply cannot support the future we are trying to build.
Right.
This theme of distraction basically defines the current American experience. We are obsessing over background noise while the structural foundation shifts beneath us.
The sheer volume of cultural and domestic news serves to dilute the impact of the macroeconomic data. The consumer's attention span is finite, and it is entirely consumed by immediate, high-friction skirmishes in their daily lives.
The DOJ's antitrust investigation into the NFL is a prime example of this. The Department of Justice is probing the league's media rights packages, specifically scrutinizing the affordability and accessibility for the consumer.
Right, because the NFL has aggressively pivoted to putting premier games behind exclusive streaming paywalls.
Yeah. Historically, the broadcast model subsidized the viewer's experience. Now the viewer pays directly. A Christmas Day game is locked behind a Netflix subscription. A wildcard playoff game requires a Peacock subscription.
And the NFL argues this is fan-friendly and points out that 87% of games remain on traditional broadcast TV.
But the mechanics of the DOJ probe highlight a deeper exhaustion. In a stagflationary environment where a consumer is deciding between paying an 8% postal fuel surcharge or $55 to check a bag, discovering that they need a third streaming service just to watch a football game creates immense psychological friction.
That's just another microtax.
Exactly. And while the DOJ litigates the cost of watching sports, massive political scandals consume the remaining oxygen in the media cycle.
Right, like the news about former First Lady Melania Trump.
Yeah, she just issued a fierce, highly publicized statement from the White House, aggressively distancing herself from Jeffrey Epstein.
And the catalyst for her statement, according to the source reports, was the DOJ's release of a 2002 email she sent to Epstein's convicted accomplice, Ghislaine Maxwell.
Right, and again, just impartially stating the facts here. Melania Trump forcefully denied any connection to Epstein's crimes, stating, quote, "I am not Epstein's victim. Epstein did not introduce me to Donald Trump."
Right, she characterized the email as casual correspondence and a polite reply.
She further framed the allegations as mean-spirited attempts to defame her reputation. And she shifted the narrative by demanding that Congress hold public hearings centered entirely on the survivors of Epstein's abuse, which is a maneuver that actually immediately secured bipartisan support from several House members.
The gravity of these cultural touchpoints is immense, obviously, but they act as a smokescreen. While the public argues over streaming rights and political scandals, the bureaucratic state is quietly executing structural changes that align with the geopolitical realities we discussed in the first segment.
The most chilling example of this quiet bureaucracy is the recent maneuver by the Selective Service system. The government is implementing an automatic military draft registration for all eligible American men between the ages of 18 and 26.
And this system goes online by December 2026.
Right.
The mechanical shift here is profound. Since the Carter administration in 1980, the Selective Service relied on a voluntary compliance mechanism. Young men were legally required to register themselves, but compliance has degraded significantly, dropping to roughly 81%.
So they're changing the rules.
Utilizing authority granted by a recent National Defense Authorization Act, the government is bypassing the individual and automating the enrollment.
Now, the sources are clear that the U.S. has not executed a military draft since 1973, and there are currently no formal plans to reinstate conscription. However, the context is undeniable. When the White House press secretary was questioned about this, they stated the president keeps his options on the table regarding a draft amidst the ongoing conflict with Iran.
Right. And an automated draft registration obliterates the abstraction of geopolitics.
Yeah.
A blocked shipping lane in the Strait of Hormuz is no longer just a reason your airline bag fee went up. It is the specific catalyst driving the federal government to catalog human capital for potential military deployment.
It is the ultimate physical constraint.
Exactly.
And navigating this reality requires an agonizing level of cognitive load from the average citizen. You are worrying about global conflict, managing debt settlement escrow accounts, calculating AI subscription costs, and on top of that, you have to decode a labyrinthine tax system just to survive the year.
Because the structural changes to the tax code intentionally complicate the survival math. The Trump tax breaks altered the mechanics of the state and local tax deduction, the SALT deduction.
Right.
The legislation raised the SALT cap to $40,000 for married couples filing jointly.
But the legislation engineered a severe marriage penalty. If a married couple decides to use the married filing separately status, the SALT deduction limit crashes down to $20,000 per person.
Which is a huge hit.
And financial planners emphasize that filing separately is sometimes mathematically necessary. For instance, if one spouse has catastrophic medical expenses that they need to deduct against their individual income.
But choosing that route triggers a cascade of lockouts.
Yeah.
Filing separately often disqualifies the individual from making direct Roth IRA contributions. It strips away access to newly implemented deductions for tip or overtime income.
The government basically forces the citizen to run highly complex tactical math models just to optimize their basic survival in a stagflationary environment.
Yeah.
The contrast between the daily grind of the consumer and the forward planning of corporate America is just jarring. We have a world preparing for automated military drafts and local grid failures, yet Kia Motors just held a CEO Investor Day where they confidently announced plans to build a brand new midsize pickup truck specifically for the U.S. market by 2030, targeting over 1 million total sales.
Because corporate forecasting relies on models that assume a return to the mean. Kia is projecting a stable 2030 market with functioning supply chains, cheap capital, and eager consumers.
They're dreaming.
They are operating in a spreadsheet reality, entirely disconnected from the physical bottlenecks of labor, energy, and geopolitics that are freezing the present moment.
So, with everything getting more expensive, from NFL games to bag fees to stamps, how does the listener actually navigate this? I mean, looking at this massive array of data, from the blocked supertankers to the locked-in housing market, the fertilizer crisis, the AI power drain, is there a takeaway here that isn't just, panic?
Well, the takeaway requires accepting a fundamental paradigm shift. For decades, we operated in a just-in-time economic model. The system was hyper-optimized for efficiency. Energy, data, and goods flowed across borders exactly when they were needed, minimizing storage costs and maximizing profits.
But a just-in-time system has zero tolerance for friction.
Exactly. When the physical world exerts friction, a war, a storm, a grid failure, the system breaks. We are now violently transitioning into a just-in-case world, a world defined by structural bottlenecks, severe physical constraints, hoarded resources, and permanent geopolitical risk.
Understanding the mechanics of this transition is basically your only defense. When you see a corporation hike a fee, you no longer view it as random inflation. You trace the mechanism back to a delayed oil tanker or a depleted foreign exchange reserve.
Right.
When an AI company launches an expensive new tier, you recognize it as a desperate race to extract capital before local municipalities literally pull the plug on their data centers.
You learn to read the physical board rather than just reacting to the digital headlines.
Which leaves us with a final massive concept to consider. We have established that the digital economy, artificial intelligence, cloud computing, algorithmic trading, it is utterly reliant on a physical foundation of copper wire, concrete data centers, and diesel fuel.
The digital cannot exist without the physical.
But the physical world is throwing up walls. Geopolitics is blocking shipping lanes. Weather patterns are destroying global crop yields. Communities are banning power consumption. So what does this all mean? If the physical reality of the planet can no longer support a hyper-connected, frictionless global system, will the next decade force a total reversal of globalization?
Will we enter a paradigm where localized physical autonomy, owning the solar panels on your roof, securing a regional food supply chain, maintaining a domestic industrial base, becomes exponentially more valuable than access to a global digital network?
Because if the kink in the garden hose never gets untangled, having a subscription to the world's smartest AI won't do you any good if the tower grid goes dark. It is the ultimate revenge of the physical world. Thank you for mapping the mechanics of this transition with me today.
The underlying mechanisms dictate the outcome. Understanding them changes everything.
To everyone listening, thank you for joining us on this deep dive. As you return to your news feeds and your daily routines, challenge the digital illusion. Look for the physical friction driving the narrative. Keep questioning the headlines, and we will catch you next time.